Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk briefly about the difference between R-selected species and K-selected species. And this video corresponds with Module 19 in your textbook. Now to start off, when we're looking at R-selected versus K-selected, what we're really looking at is the life history, and these are based off of biotic potential. So biotic potential is the maximum reproductive rate of a population under ideal conditions. But here's the thing, in nature, ideal conditions don't happen really ever. And that's because there are some factors that limit this maximum reproductive rate. So perhaps there's not enough resources, perhaps there's competition between members of the same species or between members of different species that are competing over those limited resources. Or perhaps there's some kind of disease or predation that is preventing that particular species from reaching its full potential. Now on this graph that I included here, it's just showing the number of biomass, so how much living stuff is able to be found in a particular location over time, and that potential increases over time until it reaches this carrying capacity or the maximum standing stock. This is the overall maximum biotic potential. Now there are two life history strategies, and these are the R-selected and K-selected. And these are really determined by the age that an organism produces its first offspring, how many offspring it produces, how much care it gives to helping raise those offspring, and how much energy it really costs or uses to raise those offspring and to go through that process of reproduction. The first of these two strategies is R-selected. Now, R represents the intrinsic growth rate of a population, or the growth rate of a population if there are no factors that are really limiting or hindering its overall growth. So if a population is growing at the intrinsic growth rate, that means it's growing exponentially. So on this graph here, if you have a straight line showing the rate of growth at that particular moment, that would be your R. Now, over time, if something isn't R-selected, it should be growing exponentially, and it should have that J-shaped curve. Overall, species that tend to be R-selected tend to have smaller body size in comparison to other organisms of that type. They also tend to reproduce rather young, so they're not very mature, not very old when they have their first offspring, and they have many offspring. However, most of their offspring don't survive to reach maturity. And that's because there's typically very little parental care that's offered. So some things to think about that would be R-selected would be things like cockroaches or a lot of insects. They tend to lay a whole bunch of eggs and then they just disappear and hope for the best with those eggs. Things like bacteria, most plants are all R-selected. And I also like to think of small mammals like rodents as also being R-selected. But that gets a little tricky because if you're comparing a mouse to dandelions, a dandelion's very clearly R-selected, whereas maybe a mouse might not quite be. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Typically, R-selected species exhibit a type 3 survivorship curve, and we'll talk about that in another one of our video lectures. And they also are controlled by density-independent factors. Again, we'll talk about those more in another video. K-selected species, on the other hand, typically reach carrying capacity and stay right about there. So their overall population size tends to be very stable, whereas R-selected goes through some pretty severe fluctuations. So overall, K-selected species tend to have a larger body size. They tend to take a longer time before they reach reproductive age. And when they do reproduce, they do not have very many offspring, and they put a lot of effort and care into raising those offspring. So that means that they have high levels of parental care. Overall, K-selected species typically tend to live in predictable, stable, unchanging environments, although there is a little bit of overshoot die-off, so a little bit of wiggle right around that carrying capacity line. These also tend to exhibit type 1 survivorship, and they're controlled by density-dependent factors. Again, we'll talk about those two terms in another one of our video lectures. So when we compare R-selected versus K-selected, it gets to be a little blurry between what is R versus K. So think about domestic pigs. Do they have a lot of offspring? Well, yeah, their number of offspring are pretty high. Do they have a lot of parental care? Well, yeah, for the most part, domestic pigs put a fair amount of care into raising their young. So does that make them R-selected or K-selected? Well, but it's a little harder to classify. So typically, R versus K selection is relative. So we're really just comparing pigs compared to rabbits. Well, the pigs would be K-selected. But pigs compared to humans, pigs would be more R-selected. So it depends on what you're comparing that particular species to. So for example, tree squirrels would be K-selected compared to ground squirrels, but these ground squirrels or rodents, they're R-selected compared to elephants. So there's this little bit of variation going on. And many species have these reproductive strategies that are not unique to one or the other for these life strategies. So I'm including a table here, and you will likely want to pause the video and take some notes off of this table. I think it does a good job of helping to differentiate the main overall characteristics of R selection and K selection. So I think it's a good overview, and you might want to add this to your notes. I also want to share with you this little bit of the continuously changing line where a oyster is very clearly R selected because it has a ton of offspring every year, and something like a chimpanzee or a puma are pretty clearly K-selected. But when we get into the middle of this line, things get a little bit fuzzy on is it R-selected or K-selected, and that's okay. These are just some boxes that you can plunk species into, but in real life, it's very hard to put species into these discrete boxes. It's more of a continuum. I also want to talk briefly about the way these reproductive strategies are related to invasive species. Now, invasive species tend to be R-selected, and that's because in order to be a successful invasive species, that species needs to produce a lot of offspring to take over in that particular location. Now, just to refresh your memory, an invasive species is something that is not native to a particular location and causes some type of harm. So again, it makes sense that these would be R-selected. If an invasive species was K-selected, it would be really easy to get them under control and to remove them from that particular location. Because if it takes a long time to reach maturity, and when you do reach maturity, you don't have a whole lot of offspring, well, that means your numbers stay pretty low. However, the R-selective can cause a lot of harm relatively quickly. So in summary, and I know I went kind of quick through some of this, at this point in time, after watching the video, you should be able to explain some of the factors that influence biotic potential, and be able to describe some of the traits of both R-selected and K-selected species, and provide some examples of each of those, and also explain a little bit about the relationship between invasive species and life history strategy. So again, on this graph, it's helping you to visualize the difference between an R-selected versus K-selected. So remember, R-selected species see some pretty significant fluctuations in population size. They're more of that boom and bust type of species, whereas K-selected species, those tend to be a little bit more of a steady state and kind of wiggle a little bit right at carrying capacity. So again, please leave your questions, comments, thoughts, reaction, feedback here at the end. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and I hope that you were able to learn something.